Howdy y'all and welcome back to 29 Down the Line. Today I'm in downtown Norfolk, Virginia, right on the waterfront, home to one of the most memorable transit lines I've ever ridden, the Elizabeth River Ferry. I'll start my trip at the Waterside stop in Norfolk, and once the ferry arrives, I'll be headed across the Elizabeth River to Portsmouth. The boarding process is extremely simple. You simply walk up and pay your $2 fare, and if you already have a day pass for the bus or the light rail, those are accepted here as well. The lower deck is pretty simple, just some side windows, some outdoor bench seating, interestingly enough, and then some life jacket storage. It's pretty small, so if it's a cold, rainy day, probably want to sit inside, but we'll be going upstairs. So we'll be leaving downtown Norfolk in just a moment. And the upper deck is a little wider than the lower, at least in terms of the seating area. Because again, you don't have to board up here, so it's just a bunch of outdoor benches, and it is covered, which is really nice. Before we get underway, I wanted to mention that this video will serve as my submission to the Classy Whale One Line Winners Challenge. I've been looking forward to making a video for the challenge, and I hope to see lots of good submissions. I actually couldn't decide for the longest time which line to make a video on. I always knew I wanted the line to be a ferry, and yes, I got permission because this is quite obviously not a bus or a train line. The question, though, was whether I wanted to feature this ferry or the Jamestown, Scotland ferry. After doing some research, I found that the Elizabeth River Ferry has a much more interesting history, dating all the way back to 1636. And that's nearly 400 years ago, so I went with this ferry over the Jamestown, Scotland ferry for the submission. From being first rowed by oars, to being propelled with a horse-powered paddle wheel, to steam power, and to the modern ferries used today, the ferry has seen quite a lot of change. The ferry did carry cars until 1955, when all ferry service stopped, and there was now a road tunnel under the Elizabeth River, so car ferries became kind of obsolete. Thankfully, the Elizabeth River Ferry didn't go away forever, and it came back in 1983 as the pedestrian ferry we know today. Let's talk about the route and service pattern because it's not just a quick back and forth across the river or a standard schedule all year round. On the winter schedule, in effect from Labor Day to Memorial Day, all ferries on this route run half-hourly to 3 stops: Portsmouth High Street, Portsmouth North Landing, and Norfolk Waterside, in that order. On the summer schedule, from Memorial Day to Labor Day, each of these stops is still served every 30 minutes with improved 15-minute frequencies on Friday evenings and weekend afternoons. In the summer, on weekdays, ferries operate from 5:30 a.m. until just about midnight. On weekends in the summer, however, the line doesn't start service until 10 o'clock in the morning. In the winter, weekday ferries run from 5:30 in the morning until just about 10 p.m. On Fridays, service continues until midnight. Winter scheduled Saturdays see ferries from 10 a.m. until midnight, and winter scheduled Sundays see ferries from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. The schedule is pretty simple, at least most of the time. Service patterns change when there are home games at the Norfolk Tides baseball stadium at Harbor Park. On game days, in addition to the regular ferry service, a second half-hourly ferry is operated as part of the same line as a direct service between Portsmouth North Landing and Norfolk Harbor Park. The secondary service begins an hour before the game begins and finishes after it ends. I would really like to be able to call this an express ferry, but doing so would be a bit inaccurate. Again, the regular ferry serves High Street, North Landing, and Waterside, while the stadium ferry serves North Landing and Harbor Park, bypassing Waterside as it travels between the two. This means that the two routes only share one stop, which is North Landing, so I'm really reluctant to call this an express ferry. On the day this video was filmed, the transfer here was timed perfectly, so if you wanted to connect from the regular ferry to the stadium ferry, you could. Keep in mind though that the stadium ferry schedule varies depending on when the Tides are playing, so the transfer was timed well here because of the time of the game. And if you've watched my channel earlier this year, this may sound a bit familiar to you. I have made a video on this ferry before, but when I filmed that video, all ferries were being diverted away from Waterside due to emergency dock maintenance, so all ferries ran non-stop from High Street to Harbor Park, without any intermediate stops. If you love this ferry as much as I do, Definitely go give that video a watch. A fair warning though, that video is from my early days of running this channel, so it's not as well polished as some of my more recent videos. Refocusing on the current video, both route variants have decent transit connections. The regular ferry stop at Waterside is a short walk away from the Tide light rail, and the stadium ferry stop at Harbor Park is also very convenient to the light rail, in addition to being only a short walk away from Norfolk's Amtrak station. It's unfortunate that the stadium ferry only runs for baseball games, as it could provide a very useful connection to Amtrak if it was timed with the daily train arrivals and departures. In addition to all this, bus connections are available at High Street and Waterside.
Alright, now we're on the Portsmouth side of the river. And there's the North Landing, which we bypass now, and after High Street, the ferry comes back here.
Unlike a certain fare-free ferry a little further inland, video coming soon, the Elizabeth River Ferry has a fare of $2 per trip, or $4.50 for a day pass. And as this ferry is operated by Hampton Roads Transit, or HRT, the region's transit agency, the day pass is valid for use on the ferry, light rail, and buses for as many trips as you want. What's great about this integrated fare system is that if you're coming off a bus or the light rail with a validated day pass, the ferry won't cost you anything extra. You can pay on board or buy the day pass at a ticket machine. One is even available at Portsmouth High Street. And speaking of High Street, it's where I will be getting off the regular ferry. The ferry docks in Portsmouth aren't directly on the river like they are in Norfolk, but are in little marinas like this one. In addition to acting as a small ferry harbor, the area around the High Street ferry dock is just a pleasant place to explore.
So just got off the ferry, there's a little floating dock there, and they have you wait here until they call you to board. But it's really the most informal boarding process ever. They just open the door and people walk in.
While Norfolk seems to have more things to do, downtown Portsmouth does have some nearby museums, like the Naval Shipyard Museum and Lightship Portsmouth, historic buildings, like the former Seaboard Airline building, which fortunately has its own historic sign in front of it, shopping, and restaurants. And if it's a nice day and you just want to get outside, downtown Portsmouth is great for walking, with its own riverfront pathway and beautiful old streets right next to the ferry stops. Regardless of what Portsmouth has to offer, the ferry serves as a convenient link between downtown Portsmouth and downtown Norfolk. Lots of nearby offices means that this ferry is convenient for commuters. After all, it does start running at 5:30 in the morning on weekdays. Hotels near the ferry stops mean people on business or vacation can use the ferry to get to an office building or tourist attraction on the other side of the river. And the special stadium ferry makes getting to games simple and stress-free for fans of the Norfolk Tides. Not to be confused with fans of the Norfolk Tide. I mean, how many baseball stadiums have direct access to a ferry? If I had to guess, probably not too many.
So we're now at the North Landing, also in Portsmouth, just outside the old town. I think the local ferry to downtown Norfolk goes from there. This one runs express to the baseball stadium, so we'll get the express ferry back to Norfolk. Interesting, it's like sideways seating on this ferry. It's totally different. This is one of the brand new ferries, 2023. So both ferries are pulling out of the slip at the exact same time. So it looks like we'll be chasing them to Norfolk.
One more thing about the schedule I should mention is that it only takes about 5 to 10 minutes to cross between stops depending on where you're going, and on some days road traffic down in Hampton Roads can be awful, so I'm really glad the ferry doesn't get stuck in traffic. So this is the special game day service pattern I was talking about earlier. The regular ferry in front of us stops at Waterside in downtown Norfolk, while we bypass this stop and go further to Harbor Park. And as you're about to see, the stadium ferry lets you experience one of the coolest views on this line, if you like bridges.
So you can probably start to hear it, but we're about to go under a steel grate deck bridge. We're back on the Norfolk side of the Elizabeth River. It's a very interesting dock. And the regular ferry stops way down there. In fact, you can see it. There it goes.
Overall, the Elizabeth River Ferry is a solid transit line, providing a convenient link between downtown Norfolk and Portsmouth. The route is good, accessibility is good, and the overall experience is just special. I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only one, but I do love a good ferry service. The only substantial improvements I would make are improving the frequency on the route and extending operating hours. And the next thing is not as important, but is something I would suggest for the future. Stop naming boats Elizabeth River Ferry 4, Elizabeth River Ferry 5, Elizabeth River Ferry 6, Elizabeth River Ferry 7. It lacks character and gets boring after a while, and there are plenty of famous and historical people with ties to Hampton Roads. So how about a ferry boat called the Ella Fitzgerald, or how about one called the Christopher Newport? Maybe you could go with some historic county names of the area from before it became mostly independent cities. I think the Princess Anne would have a nice ring to it. This, of course, is secondary to running a good transit line, but it doesn't mean that all creativity has to be thrown overboard, pun intended. Despite this lack of creativity, this is one of the best lines operated by Hampton Roads Transit, and I would highly recommend taking a ride regardless of whether you live here, work here, or just visiting. It's truly a line everyone can enjoy. And if you enjoyed this video, definitely consider leaving a like, commenting, or subscribing. It's all greatly appreciated. And if you have any suggestions for ferry boat names for use on this line or another line, definitely leave them in the comments below, because I'm sure they'll be more creative than what they have now. And finally, as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see y'all next week.